And now I think that we're going to start because, again, thank you very much for those of you who have arrived on time. And while some others will be arriving, thanks, we'll start now. So good morning. I'm Adrian Klein, and I'm the Research Integrity Officer for the Graduate Center. Thanks for joining us this morning to discuss research ethics. You are a diverse audience coming from all academic disciplines, but you have much in common. You're working as scholars. You work with mentors and colleagues who will have influence over your advancement. You will all write. Many of you will hope to publish. You will be subject to peer review, and you will seek jobs. What we will discuss today will have relevance throughout your career. Training in the responsible conduct of research is a requirement, but it's also great information. You need to know what the standards of practice are for research, publication, and collaboration. Now to our slides. Today, I'm joined by some contributors from across the campuses, and I think it's good for you to know that Cuny has people on each campus who are available to guide you in matters of research conduct. So I want to thank Rebecca Banchik and Bradbury, Meghan Hughes, and Tricia Mayhew-Noel, and Lynda Mules and Arita Winter-Potter, whose voices you'll hear as the morning goes by. I also want to thank the Cuny Office of Research. I want to say that this material is adopted from material that was developed by the Office of Research at Cuny Central. This all starts with the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, which require that universities that they fund to provide training. But of course, the responsible conduct of research is good information in addition to being something that is required by a federal agency. Now, Cuny has a policy that interprets what the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health ask for. And Cuny's policy is available at the link at the bottom of this page. You can't read the links that I'll have included, but this webinar will be available afterwards from my website, and I'll let you know after the event when it'll be posted. And you can check out the links, and there you can see Cuny policy. Cuny policy dictates that on each campus there be a research integrity officer. I'm the RIO, R-I-O, for the Graduate Center, and there is a RIO on each campus. So our topics today are research misconduct. I mean, do people really fabricate or falsify data? Protections. Who at Cuny can answer my concerns? Conflicts of interest. Somebody can make money off of my research. Mentoring. Can you ever negotiate with your mentor? Authorship credit. Who should you list as a co-author? Peer review. Someone will be reviewing your publications. Data management. Who does your data belong to? Collaborative research. Are you working with another lab? And export controls. Can I share this data with everyone? So what are the sources of the rules that we work under? First of all, there are federal regulations, such as those from the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health. There are state laws to be observed. When you have sponsored research, that is to say funding behind your research, your sponsor may set terms. There are institutional policies and procedures. Cuny has some. There are reporting requirements. When you get funded research, you will have to report back on the progress you're making.
Excuse me, Adrienne,
Yes?
we have some people that are having trouble hearing you. Is there any way to raise the audio input on your microphone?
I can speak more loudly, and I can check my audio settings, and I thank you for letting me know.
Sure.
I'm hoping that my voice will carry now, and I'd like to know if someone else can, or a student can respond whether or not they can hear me now. But I appreciate being told. Okay, to continue then, I was saying that standards may be set by your research community. It may be that within your specific discipline, there are standards of practice. Sorry, on the wrong screen now. And guidelines. If you are ever applying to be funded for your research, be certain that you read the guidelines carefully because there may be expectations set. And transparency. In all things, try to make certain that you have full communication and transparency. Better to anticipate problems than to have to deal with them later. Now, is the audio better? I hope so. Okay, please do continue to let us know if that's the case, if there's any problem. Okay, requirement 1. For you to meet Cuny's compliance standards, all of researchers have to attend a workshop and learn about this. You're doing that by being present today. But for those of you who are in the bench sciences, biochemistry, biology, chemistry, and physics, you have a second requirement, which is that you take online training through the program called CITY. And I will let you know directly about taking that training. That is also true of the students who are in the clinical areas like nursing and psychology, and furthermore, anyone who is doing funded research. Requirement 2. Now, good research versus misconduct versus questionable research practices. Misconduct is the worst possible behavior you can have. You should be modeling good behavior, but behavior that falls in between is referred to as questionable. And it is that gray area that often is something that has to get resolved. Now, these are some bad practices. And the first one I'm going to deal with is p-hacking, which is reanalyzing data in different ways to yield a target result. Let me give you a funny, possibly funny example of that. So let's just say, do men who eat only M&Ms go bald younger? Do young men who eat both Twix bars and M&Ms go bald on top more often than the front? Now, these seem absurd questions, of course, but if you were to run enough tests on your data, you could possibly find something, a result that seems statistically significant. But that isn't the way science should be run. Honest science demands that scientists go into their research with a clear, motivated hypothesis. So p-hacking is considered highly unethical. Don't go searching for a hypothesis when there isn't an obvious one. There isn't a clear and motivated one. Other bad behavior. And other examples too. Non-compliance, as I said before, you must comply with reporting requirements. You have to keep records, and you have to be transparent as possible with your hypothesis. But let's turn our behavior instead to good behavior. Sound research design, reproducibility, conscientious data management, appropriate authorship, that is giving credit to people who contribute to a piece of writing, appropriate mentorship, that is insisting that your faculty members give you the guidance that you need, appropriate use of funds if you have funded research, disclosing conflicts of interest, and managing conflicts of commitment. Also, the best behavior requires that you behave simply by doing the right thing in any instances when there might be any wavering. So strictly speaking, research misconduct is 3 things. It's fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Fabrication would mean making up data or results and recording and reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And plagiarism, of course, is appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving them appropriate credit. Also, please bear in mind that research misconduct requires that there be a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community. Know what your discipline requires of you. That the misconduct be committed intentionally or knowingly or recklessly, and that the allegations be proven by evidence. Now, why would anybody commit misconduct? It's not that difficult to work by the rules. Well, there are some temptations. Publish or perish is a long-standing consideration in academics, and people might be concerned that if they don't get a paper out, that they will not advance in their career. So they're a little sloppy. The need to obtain research funding, seeking promotion, or reputational motivations, such as somebody with a good reputation asks you to join them in research. In any of these cases, you might be tempted to commit misconduct. But it's not worth it. Now I'm going to turn to the panelists and ask if there are any ideas they want to inject here, any questions they want to answer. You could unmute. Any input? Okay, I'm not hearing any of my panelists speak up yet, but they could unmute now if they wished. Okay, I'm not hearing any, so I will move on then. Now, what could happen? What could happen if you are caught having misbehaved and having committed research misconduct? Well, the Office of Research Integrity, ORI, for the federal government, may impose a variety of penalties if they have a finding of research misconduct, which can include a correction of the research record, a letter of reprimand, suspension or termination of a research grant, and suspension or disbarment from receiving federal funds. Researchers who commit research misconduct may face significant professional stigma as well as corrective actions from employers. And what that means is if you have a job, you might have it at risk if you are caught, if you commit research misconduct and are found to have done so. It is not worth it. So now we're going to go through a little role play. That is to say, the person beside me and I are going to read through a little scenario on making an error in your research. And we're hoping that from this story, little story, perhaps you'll have some questions in mind that you'll submit in the Q&A. Okay, so a professor called Professor Perfect that I'll be playing, talks with her student, Stephen. And Professor Perfect says, "Stephen, congratulations on that paper we published in the Journal of Biological Studies. Did you see it has been downloaded 10,000 times from the journal's website?"
That's awesome, Professor Perfect. We're awesome. Professor Perfect, I just looked through my laboratory notebook again and realized that I used the wrong data set when I made figure 3 for our paper. It doesn't affect the conclusions we made, but it could waste the valuable time and resources of another researcher who may try to reproduce our work. What should we do?
Things in my lab are supposed to be perfect. Let's just forget about it and hope no one notices.
We can't do that. That would be wrong. Why don't I write a new paper showing that there are different ways of interpreting the data in figure 3?
No, let's just contact the journal and issue a correction.
But Professor Perfect, how will that affect our reputation?
So, in that scenario, an error was made. They noticed the error. And what should they do about it? If any of you have an idea, type it in, or a question, type it in. And in the meantime, I'm hoping that my panelists might have a response to that. Can a researcher ignore an error that they noticed? My panelists would have to unmute in order to speak up.
Hi everyone. My name is Meghan Hughes. I'm the Acting Research Integrity Officer at the Advanced Science Research Centre. So if a researcher notices an error, the best thing to do is contact the journal and issue a correction. It would be far worse to leave it and have anyone who's reading the journal contact you or accuse you of research misconduct. That can open an investigation. And as Adrienne has already mentioned, there are several repercussions for being caught conducting research misconduct.
Thank you, Meghan. Do we have input from someone else?
Hi, everyone.
Lynda,
This
good
is
morning.
Hi, this is Lynda Mules. I'm the Rio at John Jay College. And I would just, I agree with Meghan, and I would add that by retaining errors in the research record, in the published record, that impacts science going forward. Not only could someone identify that you committed an error, that you have an error in your publication and accuse you of misconduct, but there's also the possibility of just altering the academic record going forward. And I want to also mention that I think one of your questions that you posed, Adrienne, was what if there's a disagreement between authors about whether the correction should be addressed? And some journals will use peer reviewers to evaluate that, to determine whether an error was made and a correction should be made.
Thank you. There are sometimes disagreements between authors. Yes. Meghan.
Hi. So your final question is, how does requesting a correction affect an author's reputation? Now, in general, it'd be far worse to leave a known error than it would be and leave that out in the world for other scientists or researchers to see than it would be to issue a correction and say, you know, I found this mistake, this is what it should be. And then that correction is also published and available so that all research can see that going forward.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct. So you should not ignore an error. And it is far better for someone's reputation to have pointed out an error. Journals do print corrections. They do all the time. And that is what should be requested in this case. So the ways to address that problem, which we just raised, were looking once again at our list of ideal behaviors, to use sound research design and methodology and reproducibility in your results, and then appropriate authorship, that is to say, everybody would have read what it was submitted and approved of it, and appropriate mentorship, because the faculty or the lead author should have been certain that everybody was on board with what was published. So how to avoid this problem? Whoops. Okay. Now, I think that we would
Adrienne?
all, yes.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? We have a question
Please,
in
Meghan.
the Q&A session that says, what if the error was not detected by the researcher on time?
What if the error was not detected on time?
In
It
time,
could be, if that is the question, then it can be that the journal be asked to print a correction afterwards, an erratum, and they will. I hope that answers the question appropriately, okay? Okay, so the next issue we're going to go into is plagiarism and how to avoid the problem. Now, I believe that we would all agree that using the words and ideas from another person without attribution is acceptable, is, got you there, unacceptable. Okay, so how do we avoid the problem? First, you acknowledge the contributions of others. When you use verbatim text, use quotation marks and a citation. That is to say, if you're verbatim, word by word, using someone else's texts, use quotation marks. If you're summarizing or paraphrasing what someone else wrote, cite your source. When at all possible, cite primary sources. And when you are in doubt about facts that you think might be in common knowledge, make a citation. Make it clear that someone has already made this as a statement of fact and that you can pin it to an individual. Okay, so now that we understand that using the words and ideas from another person without attribution is unacceptable, what about copying your own work? Perhaps you haven't heard of self-plagiarism, but you have to be careful about how you use what you have written previously. Once again, we'll do a little role play. Tricia, good morning. Do you have any input now?
Hi. Well, on self-plagiarism. So let's look at the role play, and then I'll get involved.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So in this role play, Jess, a student, is writing her thesis after 6 grueling years of study with Professor Winter. Due to excellent mentoring, Jess has published 3 first author papers that she co-wrote with Professor Winter. As she begins writing the literature study of her thesis, she copies and pastes some of the introductory materials from the papers she wrote. As Professor Winter begins reading early drafts of the thesis, he becomes suspicious.
Jess, your introductory material in chapter 1 of your thesis is very well written. Did you get any help?
I simply pasted some of the material from the first couple of papers that I wrote.
I don't think you should do that. Isn't that self-plagiarism?
Well, I wrote it, and my thesis is simply the same work that went into the papers. What's wrong with cutting and pasting the introduction? The data is exactly the same as in the papers. So, how to avoid this problem? Tricia, do you have any input here?
Well, I agree. In avoiding, well, in self-plagiarism, you have to remember that you are now presenting your work as original work once again, and this, of course, can be misleading. So, to avoid this, you should, of course, always pull from whatever text that you're using and ensure that you contextualize this within your published work. You can also now look at the work in different ways, yes, but it's always good to always reference back to what you originally conducted.
Yes. Do we have a response from any other panelists or any questions?
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, this is an interesting scenario, I suppose. But I think if we're talking about self-plagiarism in terms of writing a thesis compared to publications that have been published already, I think different universities actually will treat this differently. Some universities don't necessarily require you to write a thesis if you've published 3 papers in the same field. You can just stick those publications together, but they are publications from those particular sources. So you're not copy pasting, it's really just the whole publication. And that can be a thesis. I've seen that in some universities. So that's I guess more of putting a question out there.
Okay. Remember at the beginning, I said that there might be institutional rules or standards of practice in a particular discipline. It can be that those things vary. But the safest route is the route, that you cite where you've used the text before. That certainly would be the safest thing to do. It must be clear that you publish something, or rather it is advised that you make it clear that you published something before in a subsequent publication, in any subsequent publication. If you don't, you have introduced redundant information, and searches may not reveal the original source. And that may deny credit also if you had co-authors on the original paper. So you want people to refer to the original place where you published something, and that can only be possible if you cite it in any subsequent publications. So the safest thing to do is cite where you have used the text before. Do I have any other input from any of the panelists? Responses to that?
I would just add one thing, Adrienne, this is Lynda, that it's important also to consider copyright if you've published in a journal, because some journals retain copyright ownership of publications. And so if you don't cite the work that you've published in that journal, then that would not be acceptable by copyright practices.
Yes, better safe than sorry. That's a very good point. I thank you for adding that. I think that if there aren't questions, we'll move on to the next topic. Do you see any questions to answer, panelists? Okay, then we'll move on to the next topic.
Hold on, Adrienne, we do have some questions.
Okay.
Let's see, yeah. What should the student do given the intro still contextualizes her work? Does she paraphrase her own intro? I'm not sure that I totally understand that question, but I think we addressed kind of what is best practice, which is to just use quotes, quotation marks if you're using directly quoting material that you've published somewhere else in a separate publication, and also to use citations, appropriate citations, if you're referencing work that you've published elsewhere. There's a question, what is the ethical reasoning for self-plagiarism being wrong, besides possibly cutting into profits exclusivity of publishers?
Interesting. Seeing a profit motive.
But again, I think we talked about sort of the ethical implications of self-plagiarism, which is that it affects the research record, that when you are publishing something and suggesting that it's original scholarship, when in fact it's not exactly original scholarship, it's already been published in the research record, that has implications.
Yeah, I think that this is mostly for clarification. It's not that, I mean, I understand the person is questioning whether it is unethical, but the issue here is clarity in your scholarship. You want people to have gone to the original source. Again, it may be that there's a copyright, it may be that there was a co-author, but even if those don't pertain, still in all, you want people to go to the original source, the place where you originally did the text, submitted the text, or submitted the idea. And you're sort of confusing and polluting the record if you don't send them to the original source. So cite yourself, simply cite yourself. Put in a citation for the original place where it was published. Okay, I think that we can move on.
Yes, I think so.
So, the City University of New York also provides some protections. Oh, there we go. Provide some protections. And they have offices and officers who look out for and make certain that we abide by federal rules. These things also fall into the responsible conduct of research, but are handled by individuals outside of my office. So for instance, if you should be working with animals in your research, there are protections and rules about animal welfare. And there is an IACUC, an IACUC committee that oversees the use of animals. And if you're working with biological materials, there are environmental health, safety and risk management rules. And on each campus, there's an institutional biosafety committee to make certain that your safety and the safety of your subjects are observed. And then there are human subjects and their protection. And on each campus, there's a human research protection program officer. At the Graduate Center, that is Rebecca Banchik, and she is with us today. And Rebecca, we're going to switch to your screen and you're going to share with us a brief introduction to human subjects research and the rules regarding it.
Yes, hold on 1 second. Let me just share. Okay, hold on.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca. As Adrian said, I'm the director of the HRPP at the Graduate Center. So I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot of what the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, does and what our role is here at the Graduate Center. So first, what is the IRB's role and who is an IRB versus an HRPP? So HRPP, you'll hear that acronym if you conduct human subjects research. We are responsible for reviewing any research studies that involve human subjects. So the animal projects that were just mentioned go to that IACRA committee. Or if you're doing research that does not involve actual human subjects, then it wouldn't come to the IRB. And we review and oversee for the different campuses. Each school has an IRB that represents, or an HRPP that represents the IRB, which is shared across CUNY to make sure we follow the ethical and federal guidelines in terms of approving human subjects research. So I will very briefly just give you a couple important points. Who can act as a principal investigator? So a principal investigator is the lead researcher on a human subjects research study. And so in order to be a principal investigator, you have to be affiliated with us at CUNY. So you need to be either actual faculty, but in your case, it would be that you are a student. And if you are a student, you would have to have a faculty advisor added to your project with you to work through the project and be your mentor and advisor on the study. Requirements for, I think I might have skipped, sorry, hold on. Whoops, hold on, sorry, technical difficulty. I'm gonna back up here. So requirements for researchers, I'm not gonna get into a lot of detail right now just because this is a lot of information, but we use an electronic system at the Graduate Center and at all of CUNY. It's called Ideate. You will ultimately create a profile and an account through this system. There's also the city training that Adrian mentioned for your requirements for RCR. There's also city training that's required for human subjects research. So it's the same website, the same platform, but there's different modules that you need to complete. So those are just things to keep in mind that you need to be able to present the certificates of completion once you submit for actual human subjects research approval. And then just so everyone's on the same page with what the definition of human subjects research is, research defined by our federal regulations for the IRB is that you're conducting a systematic investigation, including research development design, and that you're testing something to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And that's a really important piece of that definition, and is sometimes confused by case reports or quality improvement projects that don't meet that definition of being generalizable. And we can talk offline at any point when people have specific research questions they're trying to work through. A human subject is the trickier of the definitions, and that is you need to be obtaining information from a living individual. So if you're working with only what's called decedent data, so data of people who are no longer alive, then it's by definition in our regulations not considered human subjects data. So it's important to just keep that in mind down the road when you plan on doing your research. And there's ways that we collect information from human subjects, either through intervention or interaction. So an intervention would be a proper clinical trial or actual altering of care or changing the course of someone's treatment. or actually intervening to give a psychiatric treatment or a behavioral assessment, versus interaction, which is lower risk and tends to be most of the research that we see at the Graduate Center, which will be surveys and focus groups and interview-based type research, where there's a lower risk and there's not an actual intervention happening, but there is an exchange of information that's being collected. Or there is the possibility that you're not actually interacting with anyone live, that you are actually working through an existing database, working through medical or student records, but you will have access potentially to identifiable information that has some sensitive material associated with it. So there are the options of potentially doing what we call a chart review or a public database review, and some of that information may contain sensitive private information and would still then constitute a human subject. And then again, very briefly, because there's so much I could talk about, but I'm not going to today, which are just some things to think about when you are conducting human subjects research. Areas that we look at on our side of the IRB to make sure you're following the ethical guidelines and the federal regulations is in making sure that your project has a very expansive outline in terms of what's expected, from beginning to end of involvement with participants and what that looks like, recruitment, how you're going to determine your eligibility criteria, what the study procedures are like, what are the risks, what are the benefits. All of those details need to be included. We look very closely at your data security plans. How are you planning to store all of the research data that you collect? Will it be encrypted? Is it password protected? Are you coding your data? These are terms that you will become familiar with if you aren't already. We also look at the type of population that you're enrolling. If you're enrolling children, there are special things we need to just pay attention to in the regulations to make sure they're protected. We also need to spend a lot of time focusing on the consent process and what that entails. What are you going to do to engage participants in informing them about their research options, as well as getting proper permission to engage with them as research participants? And we speak a lot about privacy and confidentiality. You'll hear those terms come up a lot if you go through the process of working with the IRB. We need to make sure that participants are ultimately protected in terms of privacy, how they're enrolled, what the engagement is like, where the physical space that they're being spoken to with you, the procedures and what type of environment that's being conducted in. And then for confidentiality, we really focus on how the data is being maintained. Are you sharing the data with other researchers? Are you storing the data in ways that are protected and safe and would minimize any kind of risk or harm to the participants if their data was to be lost or stolen? And we focus a lot on that. And so that's the quick intro just of the IRB. And so I don't know if there's questions.
Share screen again. It's not showing up.
So then, yeah, I think Adrian, you would start sharing your screen again.
Thank you, but I appreciate the information. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to share screen.
That's all right. And for some reason, I can't see the Q&A suddenly. I was going to try to see. Oh, here it is. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a few questions. Are there any resources available through Cuny or elsewhere to aid in creating an initial application through Ideate? And so, yeah, so there's Ideate actual help videos on the on our HRPP website at the Graduate Center. Those are more technical in manner. They'll help you with the actual process of working through Ideate, which I warn you is not the easiest of systems. But you just have to be patient and try your best with it. But in terms of content, we don't have exact templated wording or how to answer questions in the application, mainly because every study is different. And we really want researchers to think about their answers and think about their protocol. We don't want people to just use boilerplate language without the thought process that goes with how you develop a protocol. So we do have consent templates that you would work with, and those have a lot of templated language that the institution uses. But even in the consent forms, there's a lot of fill in the blank because, again, every study is very different. So I do encourage everyone to look at the Cuny, both the Cuny Central website as well as the HRPP website that we have at the Graduate Center. I try to put up a lot of information, and if anyone needs to get in touch with me, I can give you a lot more detailed information. And then
other questions that reply that are HRPP directed questions.
Yeah, I'm seeing there's another one. If you're planning on working with existing data sets, should we run that by our office, or should we do that if certain conditions are met? So secondary data analysis does usually involve human subjects and does require IRB review. Unless it is a completely anonymous data set that you're working with, then I would say it's not human subjects research. But most of the time, people who are working with existing data sets have either directly or indirectly access to the coding system or the individual identity of the participants. And so then it is human subject research and should come in.
Rebecca, I have a question for you. What are the consequences of doing human subject research inappropriately and then having that discovered after the fact?
So there's a few things. So there's a process, certainly through the IRB, where if you are in some kind of non-compliance by either doing something that's outside of the approved protocol, or what we'd say is a protocol violation or a deviation to what was approved, you have to report that to the IRB, and that gets evaluated to decide if you have something that's considered continuing non-compliance, which is concerning, or if it's a one-time situation that can be kind of all right, you learned from the mistake, don't let it happen again. But it's serious and obviously not ideal to have to report that, and also not advised to get to a point where you're reporting multiple issues or instances of having done something outside of protocol. My big tip for anyone is to make sure you're well-versed in what's approved in your study and to have access to your protocol, to know what your consent forms say, and to not try to go rogue or not be in communication with the rest of your study team, because there can be a lot of misunderstandings about edits and amendments that have happened over the years of a study. A common thing is that someone joins a study several years later and the original PI starts doing something, forgetting that there had been changes that no longer make those original activities approved or the active case. And so that can get anyone in trouble. And so from the IRB side, it can be problematic if there's a large enough issue, because it can affect you getting funding. It can affect your reputation, certainly as a researcher. The more immediate risk, I would say, is that it can potentially hold up other studies of yours, because if we see that there's a consistent issue or that there's some reckless research activities happening, you may be asked to stop doing research, which will just affect your forward progress. And so you don't want to get audited, you don't want to get investigated for not doing what you're supposed to based on your protocol.
Thank you. And I never want to be emphasizing the bad behavior, because I think what we're revealing in this session is that it's not difficult, given the resources available at Cuny and the people you can confer with. It's not difficult to do the right thing.
Right.
So let us all try to do good research, and then there are no ill consequences down the road.
Yes, and it's also really important that to keep in mind that it's the researchers and the research team's responsibility to be aware of your approval period of your study, to know what approved and most current documents are in use for your study. That is not mine or Lynda's or anyone. It's not our responsibility to manage your research portfolio and the research records. So if you were to get audited from your funding source or internally, you need to have record of your participants and evidence that they consented, and signed documents if that applies for your study, and your data sets. That's not something we monitor. And so sometimes a mistake happens that students will just think, well, the IRB is responsible for the research, so they're in charge of keeping me on my toes with the research. But we do not control that. That's all on you. Lynda, were you going to add
Yeah,
something?
I just want to add one thing. Adrian, you asked, like, what are the possible repercussions? And I don't think you mentioned this, Rebecca, but I would just add that if you make the mistake of starting research with human subjects without getting IRB approval, then you run the risk of not being able to use the data that you collected. And that could, I think that's something that could potentially really affect a graduate student who's trying to complete a thesis. You definitely want to, if you have any question about whether the work that you're doing requires an IRB review or a determination of exemption, then you should get in touch with Rebecca or the HRPP coordinator at the campus where your advisor has a primary appointment, and have a discussion before you do any data collection or work with any data that you're provided by anyone else.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and you also want to be careful because it's happened all too often where somebody has gotten all the way to the point of I'm ready to present at a conference or publish an article, and they're looking for my IRB approval. So then they come running to the IRB and say, okay, can I get my IRB approval? But we can't give you IRB approval for a study that you've already done without approval. It doesn't work retroactively. So the definition of research is not that you plan to publish. It's not in the definition to say intend to publish. But if you intend to publish, you need to at least discuss with us whether your project needs IRB approval. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Okay.
Perhaps we'll move on to the next topic. I will say that human subject research is not something that everyone who is listening in today will have in their research. Nevertheless, it is so common in academia, it is very useful, I think, for everyone to have an idea of what this covers. And I thank you very much for that really good and comprehensive, really quick review. Thank you.
Sure.
And someone has asked whether or not these slides will be available later, and answers to questions will be delivered later. The answer to both is yes. The slides will be available at my website. I will let you all know afterwards what the link will be to it once it's been posted. And besides that, we'll try to answer all of your questions, but I would best like to answer the questions during this session, not afterwards. So once again, I ask my panelists if any of them want to unmute and address anything that's come up so far. Any responses? Okay, if not, then I think that we will carry on. I believe I have just now shared my screen. Yeah, okay. So once again, we should be at the screen for conflicts of interest. So CUNY has a policy about financial conflicts of interest. That is to say, if somebody knows that there could be financial gain from the results of their research, it must be declared openly at the start. There are also conflicts of commitment, which could happen if a researcher has a relationship with an institution or an individual, which affects whether or not they're part of a research team, and honoring time commitments made, because someone may say that they can devote a period of time that they cannot later. These things need to be resolved and determined up front. On each campus, there's a college conflicts officer. The CUNY conflicts officers are listed online, and you can turn to them if you have questions about these things. The link to CUNY's policy is on the screen. Again, too small for you to see now, but later you can see it in the slides. Now you have a relationship with your mentor, and it's an interesting one because your major professor guides you toward your degree and may be even influential in what happens to you next professionally. You're working toward grades and the approval of someone. You should be clear with them what their expectations are of you. So the byword is proactively set expectations up front. Clarify how you're going to be evaluated. Make it clear with your faculty members who will be doing what the distribution of responsibilities is in your research, What are the standard operating procedures if you're working in a lab? What is the criteria for establishing authorship and ownership? That is to say, if you do ultimately publish, who gets prime authorship? And to be aware of what it is that, say, Cuny or your funder might have as a requirement. Having covered that, now we have another role play about competing interests. Here's the setup. Stephen, a graduate student, is looking forward to starting his thesis work in the lab of a well-known professor on campus, Professor Brown. The research project he'll be working on is supported partly by the university, but mainly by Hughes Enterprise, a company of which Professor Brown is a co-owner. So I'm going to play Professor Brown, and I start out by saying, Stephen, this is not a big deal, but I want you to know that I am part owner of a company named Hughes Enterprise, and Hughes Enterprise is funding the research on which you'll be basing your thesis.
Oh, I thought the university was supporting the study. Should I be concerned about your relationship with Hughes Enterprise?
Not at all. As I mentioned, it's no big deal, really. But you should also know that my company and I will probably make money off of the research we're doing. Oh, look, it's almost time for lunch.
Does this mean anything for my thesis?
No. The fact that I am part owner of Hughes Enterprise and the company is funding this study will have no effect on your ability to carry out the objectives of your research, of your thesis, excuse me. Don't worry about that at all. My priority is making sure that you graduate with your doctoral degree on time. Hi, Stephen. I know it's late, and I know that I asked you to stay late to work on these experiments last week, but things are really moving along with the research.
Okay, Professor Brown, I would also like to spend time at some point working on my thesis when we're done with these experiments, if that's all right.
Oh, of course. No problem at all. But we are getting ready to license out our research findings, so I'm sure you understand that working on this is priority. So, how to avoid this problem? I'm going to turn to my panelists now. Do they see a problem? Do they see a problem with a faculty member having an interest in a company that may make money off of research?
Hi, this is Tricia.
Go ahead, Tricia.
Sorry about that.
That's all
Was
right.
that, Arita?
Yes.
Hello, Rita.
Absolutely. When there's a conflict of interest where a principal investigator has a dual role in which they have a company as well as supervising students or doctoral students, their roles need to be clearly defined. The students should absolutely be informed of these competing interests. And there should also be someone to monitor, such as like I guess like a overseer, to ensure that these competing interests don't conflict or interact with the role of the individual. So to avoid this problem, there should absolutely be someone an independent person who can act as an overseer. Another way is to, of course, have the student very much aware as to the competing interests, such that if it comes down to this, they will know where to go to and who they can seek guidance to. Arita?
And just to piggyback on what Tricia was saying, usually in cases like this, where there is a PI who does have, who may have shares in a company or who is a part of a company, it will usually come to the conflicts committee, and they will put and if they have a student that's also part of the project, what it is, they'll put a plan in place so it doesn't prevent the student from, yes, the student is aware of the conflict, that the researcher is involved in another company. However, a management plan is put in place with someone that oversees that plan to make sure that the student also is able to do their whatever work that they need to do with regards to their getting their, they're getting their degree for their own research stuff. So there is something in place. So that's it.
You just used a term I wanted to clarify again. You used the term PI. I think everyone would be familiar with that. Principal
With
investigator.
researchers,
I haven't been using that. Yeah, I haven't been using that term yet today.
Apologies, researchers.
Yes, well, a PI is the principal investigator. So that is to say, if you have funded research, that's the person whose name is at the top of the grant. That's the person who has ultimate responsibility. You also mentioned a conflicts committee.
Right.
Yes.
So when you have researchers, so the important thing is researchers are supposed to notify the institution that they may have vested interest in a company, whether, they have shares in it, they're part of it. So the institution knows. So if they are working with a postdoc or a student, they also need to let them know that, because it's important for us to protect the student with, as far as, yes, they still need to do their research, in order to graduate. So we need to make sure that there's somebody outside that if they feel like, I'm maybe spending more time with the researcher doing his work, and I'm not spending time on doing my own research so that I can graduate. So there is an overseer, that there is somebody that they can go to that would be the liaison for them if they feel that there is an issue.
And of course, I would say that when you're publishing, you obviously have to declare any potential conflicts of interest like this anyway. And in terms of a student, if they're trying to work out who to approach, Arita has just mentioned who the student could ask about these things, but you've also got an advisement committee for graduate students. So there's a portion of the meeting that you have as a student with your advisement committee where you can raise any potential issues about your supervisor.
Thank you. You have resources, in other words, people to confer with about this. And
yeah, and it's important that they know, that students know this, because I know sometimes students feel like, well, there's nobody that they can go to when they feel that there's an issue, and there is. For the conflicts, they can go to the overseer for that project. And just remember that the people that you do go to are to keep this, their role is to keep whatever you bring to them confidential. So it's not for them to divulge this information. It's between you and the person that you're having the conversation with. And they're really there to guide you and make sure that they serve in your best interest.
Arita, would you agree, therefore, that conflicts of interest can be managed?
Yes, it definitely, as long as it's made that everybody, the students made aware, the institutions are made aware that there is a conflict, it could definitely be managed. And there are, management plans that are put in place to manage it, so that it definitely can be managed as long as people, the institution is aware of it. It's the conflict when nobody's made aware of the conflict and they don't know. That's where you get into the issue where it can be managed. But because we have the conflict of interest officers at the various campuses, one of their roles is to make sure if there is a conflict, to take the appropriate steps to make sure that it is managed in an appropriate way.
We have so far addressed primarily financial matters of commitment, of conflict potentially, but there are also reputational potential conflicts of interest. That is to say, somebody agrees to be part of a research team, and based on the high reputation of somebody, they feel as though perhaps they're being exploited, or there are some less than entirely forthcoming research exposed. The point is that a reputation of an individual should also not blind you to research ethics. And that can be managed by discussing in advance what someone's responsibilities are.
True. Very true.
Management, in other words.
Yes. Very true.
Do any of the panelists have responses to questions asked by students?
Adrienne, there's a question in the feed. In the field of anthropology or sociology, what is a possible scenario of a conflict of interest or a conflict of commitment? So we tend to think of conflict of interest specifically being related to financial conflicts of interest, at least in terms of what's written in the policy that Cuny has related to financial conflicts of interest in research. And so the types of scenarios that would be relevant in anthropology or sociology would be the same as anywhere else. So there are specific thresholds of financial interests that a person would need to disclose if they're going to submit an application for funding for research support. And if those interests are related to the work that they do for Cuny. So if an anthropologist receives external external financial interest in something that's related to the work that they're doing at Cuny, their expertise at Cuny, then that's something that would need to be disclosed. And if it creates a conflict of interest in the context of the work that's going to be supported through that funding agreement, then it's something that would need to be managed through a conflict of interest management plan. And similarly, a conflict of commitment would be something that the anthropologist focuses their time or energy on external to Cuny. So maybe it's a nonprofit where they serve on the board and they just put a lot of their energy and a lot of their time, and does it have the potential to conflict with what they're doing at Cuny and the work that they're supervising students on at Cuny. So conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment really are not limited to the biomedical field or to the hard sciences. And anything that sort of rises to the level of reportability in the conflict of interest policy would need to be disclosed through the financial conflict of interest disclosure process.
Thank you. Arita?
No, I agree with what she said. I mean, that's right. Conflict of interest and conflict of commitment. And more so to piggyback, because most people look at conflict of interest is more, because we do have a policy that talks directly to conflict of interest, more so than it does to conflict of commitment. And, you know, as Lynda, just to piggyback back on what Lynda said, conflict of commitment is if you're working, you know, you're employed by Cuny and you have an interest outside of Cuny with a non-for-profit or another where you may serve as a board of director, but you're putting your more time within that company than you are with Cuny, that would be considered a conflict of commitment. So people have to be mindful of the two. And again, if you're not sure, definitely reach out to your conflict of interest person at your campus to get clarification. Because again, we do have the conflict of interest policy, but we don't currently have the conflict of commitment. And I don't think conflict of commitment is defined clearly as much as conflict of interest.
However, there are other resources, of course. Communication is key in any of these concerns. And you can start out by talking to your faculty member, your mentor, your executive officer, potentially the ombudsman at the Graduate Center, who is there to handle confidentially any academic confusions. So there are plenty of people in roles at the Graduate Center with whom you can discuss these things. I'll review that later.
And at
Thank you.
CUNY too, just at the other campuses as well.
And the other campuses
Yeah,
as
at the
well.
other campuses. And somebody mentioned in the comment, you know, if you are part of the union, you could definitely go to your union rep. It really is whoever you're comfortable with speaking to. You know, sometimes, you know, as students, you might not be comfortable maybe going to the conflict of interest person or the Rio. Find somebody that you feel comfortable speaking with, and definitely make sure that your concern is addressed, because what you don't want is for it to linger, right? It's something that you want addressed up front so that all parties have the clarification of what will take place moving forward. You don't want it, again, to linger, and then it turns into a bigger issue, where maybe you might not have been able to work on your research, and that may delay your graduation, you know, so that's always something to keep in mind.
Right, communication, transparency are key.
Exactly.
All right, I think I will.
I have one comment on this. There's also
Please.
something called an academic conflict of interest, in which where a peer review can be ongoing, and because the reviewer wants this to occur, they could give a favorable or respond positively to a manuscript because it presents favoring results, or results that would be in their favor. And so that's one thing we can look at also, which is called the academic conflict of interest.
It's related to the reputational conflict that I was referring to before. Yes.
Yes.
So listing again the ideal behaviors that we wish for you to adhere to, these ones apply appropriate mentorship, of course. That is to say, making sure that your faculty makes it clear to you what's expected of you. Appropriate use of funds, certainly if you have funded research, disclosing conflicts of interest, and managing conflicts of commitment. So that's what we have discussed. And now we move on to responsible authorship. Now, whatever discipline you're in, the likelihood is that you're going to be wanting to write and share your data, your information, your research. So who should be listed as an author? Now, in the humanities and social sciences, there can be single authored papers, but in the sciences, most commonly, there are multiple authors. So who do you list as an author? You list someone who made a significant contribution to the research, assumed responsibility for data collection and analysis, participated in drafting the publication and approving the final publication. So what are improper practices? Honorary authorships. Instead of mentioning at the end of a paper that you're honoring somebody's guidance, rather to list them as an author, even though they didn't contribute to the paper, that is an improper practice. And duplicate publications. That is to say, if you're trying to publish the same paper a second time, a second place. Peer review is related to authorship because you'll be publishing, potentially, and people will be reviewing your writing, and in time, you may be a peer reviewer as well. So if you are a peer reviewer, your responsibility is to assess the project for quality and make judgments regarding the importance of the research. You have to give timely review and constructive feedback, free from personal bias, and maintain confidentiality. So if you're a peer reviewer, you will want to abide by these rules, and you will want them to be the rules in force for reviews of your own work. So now we'll turn to a little role play about authorship. The setup for this is simple. A grad student, who will be played by me, Jess, approaches her faculty mentor regarding credit for some writing that she did.
Morning, Jess. How are you today?
Not so good. The anxiety from this issue has been keeping me awake at night. It's distracting me from my work, too.
Well, that sounds pretty serious. What exactly is the nature of this problem?
I really don't know if there's anything that can be done about it. I'm working with Professor Green. He asked me to write a chapter for a new book, but I think that he removed my name as an author from a chapter that I wrote with him.
Authorship questions can be tough to deal with sometimes. Are you sure that you should be listed as an author on the chapter? Did you talk about authorship when you started the project? Explain your version of the situation to me.
I thought that you might have questions, so I brought drafts of everything I worked on, including the note that Professor Green gave me to start working on the chapter. See, he commented on each draft and I did all this work.
Well, it does look like you did a lot. How do you know that you were not an author on the chapter? Did Professor Green tell you?
My friend saw a final draft of the chapter in the department office and my name was not on it. I talked to Professor Green and he was dismissive, saying it was just a good learning experience for me. So, how to avoid this problem? I turn to my panelists. This arises occasionally as an issue. If it wasn't clear from the start who was going to get authorship credit on something that a student wrote with a mentor. Any responses from my panel? I'm not hearing from anyone.
Hi. Sorry, my video's taking a second to come back on.
Thank you.
Sorry, so Meghan Hughes again here. So it's always good to have conversations with your advisors up front about authorship. When situations such as this arise, there's the complication from the mentor-mentee relationship. Since the article itself hasn't yet been published, it's technically not couldn't be considered research misconduct at this point. So it is a good idea to have another conversation with your advisor, and feeling that you can speak to the research integrity officer or your EO for some clarity on what to do. If the article had, however, been published and you believed you should have been an author, it would be considered, it could be considered for research misconduct, and you could start an investigation or make a complaint to your VO to investigate whether or not you should or should not be an author.
Well, just to clear, research misconduct is really considered, it's plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. So that's really research misconduct. Authorship wouldn't fall under research misconduct. So let's just to clarify on that. And Meghan brings up a good point. And Adrian, and you've talked about this throughout this workshop, and it really is about, communication is key, and it really is communicating from the jump. What are the expectations for you as a student with your faculty advisor? The other thing is also to always follow up with an email, so you have documentation to say, like, we had this conversation and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. It's always good to follow up with an email, just to have it as your documentation to say, we've had this conversation. I just want to make sure that we're in agreement. This is what we're doing moving forward. So those are always the key, some of the key things to think about. And as Adrian keeps saying, and I'm reiterating, that communication is always key, and doing it from the jump is always a good idea.
I do really empathize, because students, again, have this relationship with a mentor, which is a peculiar one. You may need the guidance and the endorsement of your professor for your future career. You worked hard on a project and you think you deserve credit. You want only good advice from your mentor. So how can it be that this sort of thing could arise? It's an uncomfortable and painful sort of a relationship, potentially fraught with a problem. But in most cases, it works out amicably. In most cases, a simple discussion will correct things. And that is why it is important to discuss these things. Now, I'm wondering, what is the perspective of the professor? What do you think is going through that person's mind? Lynda, do you have any input on that? Does the mentor or professor think that in fact it's just a good experience for the student and they shouldn't mind not being an author?
Well, I think, again, it comes back to issues of communication between the mentor and the student. It's hard to know whether the mentor has a legitimate case because we don't know what the expectations were from the outset of the relationship. And so that's why it's important at the beginning to have discussions about expectations and authorship. A lot of institutions have templates for mentor-mentee relationships that students and faculty can use when they're starting out in this type of relationship. And I don't think we have any specific templates for that type of thing, but they're certainly out there. It can be an awkward thing to pose to faculty that you're working with. And I think really the faculty should be suggesting these types of agreements with the students. But I turned my video on because there was a question in the chat, Adrian, related to the prior discussion. The question is, just to clarify, why wouldn't it fall under plagiarism if the professor used the student's work without citing the student? And I think just to answer that, it would potentially rise to the level of plagiarism if something was published and the person who made the contributions to the work was not cited. So it's not so much a question of authorship at that point, but a question of whose ideas, whose words were included in the publication or presentation, and were they appropriately attributed. If there's a question about that, then it would rise potentially to the level of plagiarism and could be something that's submitted as an allegation of research misconduct. Hopefully that clarifies the difference between an authorship dispute and potential plagiarism.
Thank you. So once again, turning to our template for ideal behavior, clearly in cases of authorship conflicts, appropriate authorship and appropriate mentorship are the ones that have to be followed. The faculty member should be giving good guidance to the student, and the student should have some rights in this sort of power relationship. So communication is key. We're going to move on to data management. So who owns your data? It could be your university, or if you have a contract, that is to say, if you're doing funded research, it may be your sponsor. Science students at the GC are funded. So in theory, their lab notebooks belong to the lab. You should discuss this with your executive officer. Now, Cuny does have an intellectual property policy, which you can read at the link that will be in the slides. Your data should be properly stored, and you should certainly observe confidentiality and privacy agreements. And Cuny has policies about data retention, which you can find online, especially if you have sponsored research. And the use of Cuny's computers are also supported by a policy. If you're sharing data with another institution, a researcher, say at a different university, there are a variety of types of agreements, data use or data transfer, and those are stipulated in a Cuny policy as well. What if you're doing collaborative research? You're working with somebody from a different university. Note at the bottom, it refers to a management plan. And this again is like the management plan for conflict of interest. You just have to state in writing up front what the expectations are. A management plan would include financial management to ensure that all the collaborators are in compliance with the funding agency's rules. Training and supervision. You want to address all the team members and their roles. Compliance. Again, if you have funded research, you have to comply with the rules of the funder. In general, your professor may have experience in collaborative work, so just ask. Formal agreements. So if you're going to enter into a formal agreement to do research with, say, NYU, then you have to have somebody from Cuny sign off on this. There's a signatory authority defined by a policy, which is at the bottom of the screen in a link. And examples of this kind of document would be a memorandum of agreement, which is an MOA, or more commonly, memorandum of understanding, or an MOU. There are also material transfer agreements and data transfer agreements. So if you're working with another institution, you should have in writing what your agreement is, what you're exchanging, and what rights you have to the data, who will be considered the owner of the data, and abide by the rules of your own institution, Cuny. Another issue is export control. There are materials or processes that are inherently for use by the military, but there are also dual use materials and processes that may be useful in Department of Defense settings, but also for civilian use. An example of this might be cryptography. Some people in our math department might be working in cryptography or material science research. Then there's the issue of who's doing the work. Do you have collaborators in countries, and this can apply to any field that you're in, collaborators in countries where the US has sanctions, Cuba, Iran, Syria, or Sudan? Are you a non-US citizen working in a lab on research subjects that are subject to export control? So there are rules about the sharing of information with those abroad, those in lab settings in the United States who are citizens of other countries with which the US has trade embargoes. And these things are covered under the Cuny policy, which is in, the link here points to. On each campus, there's an export control administrator. I'm the export control administrator for the Graduate Center. Now, working with these materials is often acceptable, but it will be necessary in some cases to have authorization or a license and to have the parties who are involved screened in advance. I'm going to ask now if any of our panelists have any input here, because I know some of them on a frequent basis deal with people in labs from other countries and sharing information. Meghan, for instance, have any input here?
I do, yes. So we have a number of researchers at the Advanced Science Research Center who are international researchers. We have each of them. We have every researcher coming through the building screens for. They do a compliance screen before they come in to make sure that they aren't on any list that we can't share any data with. We also have a number of research grants that would be considered under the defense article, defense category, and federally funded. So we need to be particularly careful, although, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. So we do have a number of grants that fall under defense as well. So we do screen everyone that comes into the building. What else do we do for export control? And we are very careful. So we do have a number of data security that we have in place. So we worked with the IT team to secure all of the data to make sure that it's not accessible externally. And yeah, I think that's all that we do. We do have an export control officer in-house as well. It's not my particular area of expertise, so Adrian can probably speak more to it than I can. But yeah.
Well, every export control case is different. I think Arita could agree with that. And as a consequence, everyone has to be handled on an individual case. But for the most part, the point is that there are regulations, and that, as is the case with many of these things, they can be managed. So by following the rules, even if you're doing research that is dual use, that has military applications as well as civilian, it can be done with a full declaration of what's being worked on and compliance with the federal requirements. It's a matter of letting everybody know what's happening. Arita, I suspect you would agree.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Well, export control has become a hot topic across many institutions. So export control is one of those things, if you're not sure, definitely reach out to your export control administrator, because there are questions if you do fall within, we do currently have a questionnaire that we are revamping, that if you may answer yes to a question, it may require further analysis. So definitely work with your export control administrator to make sure it's addressed and the analysis is done. And it really is just a list of like seven or maybe 8 questions that are asked. And then I know the ASRC does their own screening, and we at CUNY Central, we do the screening for the rest of the institution. So again, definitely your export control administrator. And Tricia can also speak to it, export control, because City has become one of our top schools with export control within the past few months. So she's been seeing a lot of cases come through with regards to export control.
Yeah, thanks. If I could just chime in, one of the things I think would be really important in knowing when dealing with export control is identifying whether a project may have some export control regulations involved. And anytime you can see your grant or contract discusses anything with publication restrictions or citizenship restrictions or foreign nationals not allowed to partake, those are usually your key terms to letting you know that there may be some export control regulations. Now, there are projects that may be defined upfront or the work in which you're doing may be defined as restricted work or what they call ITAR, international trade. I'm not sure. I can't remember the exact, but they may be ITAR restricted. And this particular work, when it is announced or stated within an application, you would absolutely need to conduct the research in a more restricted manner, ensuring that unauthorized persons may not have access to the project or the work that's ongoing with this particular project. And so we develop what is called a technology control plan to provide a type of guidance in working with these type of ITAR controlled or export controlled projects. So, I guess what I want to drive through is that to be able to identify these particular types of project when they come to you. And those key things that you look for, like I said, would be whether there is some type of publication restriction, and especially citizenship restriction where the project may only allow U.S. citizens to partake. Now, that does not guarantee that it's an export control project, but that's an absolutely great way to start, a great place to start.
Right. And ITAR stands for International Traffic in Arms Regulations.
Tricia,
Thanks,
thank you
Arita. I
very
appreciate
much
that.
for
No problem.
Tricia, thank you very much for so well representing City College, which of course has engineering as well as the bench sciences. And so it is a prime example of an institution that has these concerns raised in its labs.
Thank you for having me, Adrienne. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for your input. Now, we're going to begin to sum up our day together. This is first of all, I will be sharing these slides later, so all of these links will work, but from what you can see when you go to my website, and I will let you know when it has been posted, all of those of you who are attending will be sent information letting you know where and when this will be able to be viewed again. Thank you for your attention now, but these slides can be viewed later. So anyway, this is a really great little review video I would recommend. Our topics today were research misconduct, the protections that Cuny provides, etc. Once again, I want to remind you of the resources that you have available to you to discuss these things with your professor, your mentor, the executive officer of your program. There's a conflict of interest administrator on each campus, an export control administrator. If you have human subjects in your research, there's the HRPP director. Your academic affairs office will have information about plagiarism. There's an ombudsman at the Graduate Center who gives confidential counseling on academic affairs. And then there's me, the research integrity officer. And you can always reach me at rcr@gc.cuny.edu. Again, our template for ideal behavior is what we're striving for. Please bear in mind that misconduct is rare. Ideal behavior is what we aim for. Adapt good practices. Keep your reputation among your colleagues. I want to thank these agencies and these individuals who helped us today to understand these topics. And you can reach me at my email address. And thank you for your attention and stay healthy. Thanks. Bye now.